The issue of slavery. The rise of King Cotton. Prior to 1793, the Southern economy was weak. Depressed prices, unmarketable products, overcropped lands, and an unprofitable slave system. Some leaders such as Jefferson, who freed 10% of his slaves, spoke of freeing their slaves and of slavery gradually dying. Eli Whitney's Cotton Gin in 1793. Cotton production became now exceedingly profitable, 50 times more effective than picking cotton by hand. Tobacco, rice, and sugar eventually eclipsed in production. Most significantly, slavery was reinvigorated. Cotton Kingdom developed into a huge agricultural factory. Westward expansion into lower Gulf states resulted: Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama. Slaves brought into these new regions to cultivate cotton. Trade. Cotton exported to England. Money from the sale of cotton used to buy northern goods. Britain heavily dependent on cotton to feed its textile factories. 80% came from the U.S. For a time, prosperity of both North and South rested on slave labor. Cotton accounted for 50% of all American exports after 1840. The South produced 75% of the world's cotton. The Three Souths. Generalizations. The further north, the cooler the climate, the fewer the slaves, and the lower the commitment to slavery. The further south, the warmer the climate, the more the slaves, and the higher the commitment to slavery. Mountain whites along the Appalachian Mountains would mostly side with the Union. West Virginia, eastern Tennessee, northeast Kentucky, western South Carolina, northern Georgia, and Alabama. The southward flow of slaves from sales continued from 1790 to 1860. The border South: Delaware, Maryland, Kentucky, and Missouri. Plantations were scarcer. Cotton cultivation was almost non-existent. Tobacco was the main slave crop. There was more grain production, however, as in the Middle South. Unionists would overcome disunionists during and after the Civil War. In 1850, slaves equaled 17% of the population. In 1850, over 21% of the border South's blacks were free. 46% of the South's free blacks. 22% of the white families owned slaves. Of all who owned more than 20 slaves in the South, 6%. The ultra-wealthy, 1%. Produced over 50% of the South's industrial products. The Middle South: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Each state had one section resembling more the border state and another resembling the lower South. Some industrial production. Unionists would prevail after Lincoln was elected. Disunionists would prevail after the war began. Many plantations existed in eastern Virginia and western Tennessee. In 1850, slaves accounted for about 30% of the population. 36% of white families owned slaves. Of all who owned more than 20 slaves in the South, 32%. The ultra-wealthy, 14%. Lower South: South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas. Most slaves concentrated in the Black Belt of the Deep South along river valleys. Plantations were prevalent. Cotton was king. Grew 95% of Dixie's cotton and almost all of its sugar, rice, and indigo. Disunionists would prevail after Lincoln was elected. In 1850, slaves accounted for about 47% of the population. Less than 2% of blacks were free. 43% of white families owned slaves. Of all who owned more than 20 slaves in the South, 62%. The ultra-wealthy, 85%. They produced less than 20% of the South's industrial products. The planter aristocracy. The South resembled an oligarchy, ruled by wealthy plantation owners. In 1850, only 1,733 families owned more than 100 slaves, yet they dominated Southern politics. There was a strong sense of obligation to serve the public through politics, a higher proportion of front-rank statesmen produced by the South, like John C. Calhoun. They stifled democracy, widened the gap between the rich and the poor, and hampered public education. Chivalry, honor, hospitality, soft-spoken, courteous, yet incredibly high-strung. They sought to perpetuate medievalism or feudalism that had died out in Europe. Slaves and the slave system, the peculiar institution. Economic structure of the South was monopolistic, dominated by wealthy plantation owners. Plantation system. It was risky due to the fact that slaves might die of disease, injure themselves, or run away, so the system required a heavy investment of capital. Not only that, it was a one-crop economy, discouraged a diversification of agriculture and especially manufacturing. Southerners were resentful of the North made because of the huge profits at their expense, complained of Northern middlemen, bankers, agents, and shippers, resented being so dependent on Northern manufacturers and markets, repelled large-scale European immigration. Only 4.4% of foreign-born part of South's population in 1860, 18.7% in the North. Slave labor far cheaper, fertile land very expensive, and Europeans unfamiliar with cotton production. The South was the most Anglo-Saxon region of the nation. Plantation slavery. Nearly 4 million slaves existed in 1860. They quadrupled in number since 1800. Legal imports of slaves ended in 1808. Countless slaves smuggled in despite death penalty for slavers. There was an increase due to natural reproduction. Overbreeding of slaves not encouraged. Owners were still often rewarded slave women for many children. White slave owners often fathered sizable mulatto populations. Most remained slaves. Slaves were seen as valuable assets and a primary source of wealth. Slave auctions were one of the most revolting aspects of slavery. Families were often separated. There was a division of property and oftentimes bankruptcy. Slavery's greatest psychological horror. Punishment often brutal to send a message to other slaves not to defy a master's authority. Life in the newly emerging western areas were exceedingly harsh. Louisiana, Texas, Mississippi, Alabama. This is where the Afro-American slave culture developed. Slaves were deprived of dignity and sense of responsibility that free people had. They suffered cruel physical and psychological treatment and were ultimately convinced that they were inferior and deserved their lot in life. They were denied an education since it was dangerous to give slaves an education or any ideas of freedom. Slaves were often insidiously sabotaged their master's system. They poisoned their food, they misplaced supplies, they broke their equipment, or they worked in slow manners. Many attempted to escape. Some were successful in the border South, but it was next to impossible in the lower South. The Stono Rebellion of 1739. South Carolina slaves fled toward Florida, killing whites along the way. However, they did not make it. Gabriel Prosser, in 1800, he was a slave blacksmith in Virginia who planned a military slave revolt and recruited 150 men. The rebellion did not materialize, and Prosser and 26 others were hanged. Denmark Vesey, a mulatto in Charleston, devised the largest slave revolt ever in 1822. A slave informer advised his master of the plot. Vesey and 30 others were publicly hanged. Nat Turner's revolt in 1831. 60 Virginians were slaughtered, mostly women and children. Wave of killing slowed down as the revolt's aim of capturing armory. The largest slave revolt ever in the South. Over 100 slaves were killed in response. Turner was hanged. The significance of the Nat Turner Rebellion was the fact that it produced a wave of anxiety among Southern plantation owners that resulted in harsh laws clamping down on further slave institution. The Southern white paranoia resulted from these slave revolts was the fact that there was a fear of a reprisal by more slaves. They were also infuriated by the abolitionist propaganda in the North that saw them as inflaming slaves. They settled into a theory of biological racial superiority as a justification for slavery. The white majority. By 1860, only 1/4 of white Southerners owned slaves or belonged to slave-owning families. Over 2/3 of slave owners owned less than 10 slaves each. Small slave owners made up a majority of masters. 75% of white Southerners owned no slaves at all. They were located predominantly in the backcountry and the mountain valleys. Mostly they were subsistence farmers and they did not participate in the market economy, raising corn or hogs. Some of the poorest were known as white trash, hillbillies, crackers, or clay eaters. They suffered from malnutrition and parasites. They fiercely defended the slave system as it proved white superiority. Poor whites took comfort that they were equal to wealthy neighbors. The social status was driven by how many slaves one owned. Poor Southern whites someday hoped to own slaves and realize the American dream. Slavery proved effective in controlling blacks. Ending slavery might result in the mixing of the races and the black competing with white